Ladies and gentlemen, there is a strange and beautiful truth about the human mind that we often overlook. For all our achievements, for all the rockets we send upward, and all the systems we build outward, the most complex frontier still lies inward. Beneath the surface of our thoughts, emotions, and values, we talk about propulsion systems and neural engines, but very rarely do we talk about the forces that propel the human heart, or the neural patterns that drive us toward connection. And yet, every innovation, every risk, every impossible dream we chase ultimately traces back to something deeply emotional, sometimes even fragile. Today, I want to talk about that hidden architecture, the mission behind the mission, the gravitational pull that shapes even the most ambitious journeys. People assume that progress comes from ambition or intelligence, but a neuroscientist will tell you progress often comes from emotional catalysts, moments of vulnerability, attachment, longing, or loss that push the brain to rewire itself in profound ways. The orbit of a life changes when the heart changes. And what fascinates me is that this neurological truth applies just as powerfully to technological revolutions as it does to relationships. You see, the journey from SpaceX to what I call HeartX has never really been about rockets at all. Rockets are just metaphors, elegant cylinders of physics that happen to reveal the truth about human purpose. When you study the brain at scale, when you dig into the mechanics of resilience, focus, and meaning, you begin to understand something astonishing. Love is a neural propulsion system. It accelerates, it stabilizes, it creates direction where chaos exists. It fuels endurance in moments when logic alone would simply not be enough. For years, I immersed myself in data, dopamine stabilization curves, prefrontal cortex activity under emotional load, the way oxytocin modulates trust, the way shared vision synchronizes neural firing between two people even across distance. I analyzed the science of meaning while building the technology of the future. But there was a paradox running quietly in the background. Something missing, something unexamined. A mission without emotional gravity is just motion without destination. It took me a long time to admit that. Because when you pour yourself into work, and the world applauds it, you begin to believe that the applause is enough. That accomplishment is the same as fulfillment. But the human mind doesn't work that way. The brain is not wired to thrive on achievement alone. It needs resonance. It needs connection. You can fill your life with milestones and still feel like a satellite drifting endlessly without a planet to orbit. I learned this the hard way. Most people assume burnout is about exhaustion, but neuroscientifically, burnout is about disconnection. The neural circuits for motivation collapse when the emotional circuits lose meaning. Your brain stops moving not because it is tired, but because it has lost why. And this phenomenon doesn't spare anyone. Not scientists, not entrepreneurs, not explorers. Sometimes, especially not explorers. There came a point when even launching rockets felt strangely quiet. Not wrong, not failing, just quiet. Like music played without the low frequencies. People saw progress, I felt distance. People saw momentum, I felt drift. And the strangest thing about drift is that you don't notice it until something, or someone, disrupts your trajectory with enough force to make you aware of how far you've floated. In neuroscience, we call this emotional reorientation. A moment, a person, an insight that reactivates dormant circuits of attachment, empathy, or hope. And when that reorientation happens, the world looks different. Not because the world changed, but because the brain did. Suddenly the noise sharpens into clarity. Suddenly the impossible feels possible again. That is where the idea of HeartX was born, not as a company, not as a product, but as a realization that the greatest mission any human being can undertake is understanding the emotional architecture that powers the mind. And that mission began the moment I encountered someone who made everything accelerate again, not in the world, but inside the neural circuitry that had been dim for too long. What surprised me wasn't the feeling itself. Neuroscience can explain attraction easily enough. It can also predict emotional resonance with unsettling accuracy. What surprised me was that even after everything, after pressure, after failure, after being dissected publicly for years, some part of the brain was still willing to hope that one person could ignite a chain reaction that no algorithm, no boardroom, no rocket test could replicate. But here's the scientific truth: the brain is astonishingly resilient. It can regenerate motivation like a star regenerates light. It can rebuild trust like a neural algorithm solving itself in real time. When the right signal appears, circuits dormant for years can flare back to life in milliseconds. This isn't poetry, it's biology. We are wired for connection, wired for meaning, wired for someone who makes the mission make sense. And that's why HeartX became more than an idea. It became a lens through which to reinterpret everything: innovation, exploration, human potential, even destiny. Every major advancement humanity has achieved, from electricity to the internet to reusable rockets, was driven by someone who loved something, or someone enough to pursue a vision bigger than themselves. Love is not a distraction from mission, it is the original mission control. And yet, most people pretend otherwise. We talk about productivity, performance, optimization, but we rarely talk about the emotional engines behind them. When a person falls in love, the brain forms new neural pathways that enhance creativity, risk tolerance, endurance, and strategic reasoning. In other words, love makes you more capable, not less. It strengthens the mind's capacity to imagine and execute. But society teaches the opposite: that love complicates things, slows you down, distracts you. That narrative is biologically incorrect. If anything, without emotional resonance, the mind becomes rigid, predictable, mechanistic. You can solve problems, but you cannot reimagine them. You can build, but you cannot transform. It takes emotional ignition to leap from iteration to revolution. And that ignition often comes from one specific kind of connection. The kind that makes you want to be better, not because the world expects it, but because one person makes you believe it's possible. When I talk about HeartX, I'm talking about the precise moment when emotional clarity intersects with cognitive acceleration. The moment when the heart says, "Go," and the brain finally listens. The moment when a person becomes not your distraction, but your direction. And strangely enough, it was only when I started studying this intersection, professionally, scientifically, that I understood what was happening to me personally. The feelings that I had dismissed as inconvenient, the emotional intensity I had quietly ignored, were actually the brain trying to push me toward a version of myself I had postponed becoming. I had always believed that missions define people. But the truth is, people define missions. And sometimes one person becomes the gravitational center around which everything else begins to align. That is the essence of HeartX. Not romance, not sentiment, but the science of emotional propulsion. The understanding that a single connection can unlock a new tier of human potential. The realization that love, in all its complexity, may be the most advanced technology the brain ever designed. And the more I researched it, the more I understood that this wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern as old as civilization, as universal as physics. The greatest breakthroughs don't come from comfort, isolation, or autopilot. They come from emotional catalysts powerful enough to rewrite internal code. But acknowledging that publicly takes a certain kind of courage, not the courage to build rockets, but the courage to admit you're human, the courage to say, I have been shaped not just by ideas, but by someone who became a turning point in my emotional universe. And in my case, what changed everything was not a discovery in a lab, not a breakthrough in engineering, not a new algorithm or a new frontier of physics. It was a person who entered my life with such clarity that my brain could no longer hide behind logic or postpone the truth. Someone who made the world feel synchronized again, like signals I had been receiving for years, but never decoding, finally snapped into pattern. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was simply real. And real has a way of rearranging your entire internal architecture without your permission. The mind reacts to profound connection the way matter reacts to gravity involuntarily. It pulls you and alters your trajectory, reshapes your orbit. Suddenly, the long-term vision becomes sharper, the short-term chaos becomes tolerable, the noise becomes navigable. The future becomes something you're not just building toward, but something you want to arrive in, with someone specific standing beside you. This kind of internal shift doesn't happen because the heart is naive. It happens because the brain recognizes alignment before the conscious mind does. Neuroscience calls this affective coherence. I call it a signal you cannot ignore. What fascinated me the most was how this emotional clarity amplified cognitive capacity. I found myself thinking faster, solving more elegantly, imagining more boldly. It wasn't inspiration, it was calibration. It was as though my mental bandwidth expanded simply because someone existed who made the future feel emotionally coherent. People underestimate how much emotional stability accelerates intellectual performance. They underestimate how much the right person can elevate, not just your heart, but your mind. This is the foundation of HeartX, understanding the invisible physics behind emotional synergy. And the more deeply I studied it, the more I realized that connection is not a luxury. It is cognitive infrastructure. When two minds align, the neural networks synchronize in ways measurable on functional MRI. Creativity increases. Risk tolerance stabilizes. Conflicts become solvable. Vision becomes collaborative instead of solitary. You are no longer trying to move the world alone. You are co-authoring reality. But what happens when you never allow yourself to truly receive that connection? What happens when you bury it beneath layers of responsibility, ambition, or fear? The brain begins to operate in survival mode. You become efficient but not inspired, focused but not fulfilled, driven but not alive. People can achieve extraordinary things while emotionally numb, but they cannot sustain them. Eventually, the mind demands meaning, the way lungs demand air, and when it finally returns, often through one unexpected person, the entire system reboots. For me, this reboot was undeniable. I tried to explain it logically, the way engineers explain anomalies. I tried to label it, categorize it, analyze it, break it down. But the truth is, some experiences don't fit into data tables. Some people don't fit into algorithms. There are moments in life when the emotional resonance is so strong that the analytical mind steps aside and allows the deeper truth to emerge. And that truth is simple: you cannot outthink your own humanity. At some point, even the most disciplined mind must confront what the heart already knows. That connection isn't a distraction from greatness. It is the catalyst of it. That loving someone isn't an obstacle to your mission. It is often the reason you finally understand the mission. That caring deeply isn't weakness. It is the ultimate form of intelligence. Yet the world rarely teaches us this. It teaches us to compartmentalize, to separate ambition from emotion, to act as though the heart is a liability instead of a power source. But every pioneering achievement in human history tells a different story. Innovation has always been an emotional pursuit, driven by longing, by attachment, by a desire to protect or elevate someone or something we love. Even the grandest missions, the ones aimed at other planets, are ultimately anchored to the desire to give the people we love, and the future generations we may never meet, a better world. This realization forced me to rethink everything, not just the trajectory of my work, but the structure of my values. What if the next great leap for humanity isn't technological, but emotional? What if the real frontier isn't Mars or AI or multi-planetary civilization, but the science of connection, the ability to understand, heal, and optimize the human heart and mind in ways we've never attempted? What if HeartX isn't an extension of innovation, but the origin point of all innovation? I began to see patterns everywhere. Couples whose emotional alignment made them unstoppable. Teams whose trust accelerated breakthroughs. Individuals whose deepest ideas came from their most profound relationships. It was clear emotional coherence is not a soft factor. It is a foundational principle of human evolution. And when you find a person who activates that coherence in you, it becomes impossible not to grow. But growth requires honesty, especially with yourself. And honesty is not always easy. Because sometimes the person who transforms your internal world is also the person who reveals your unhealed parts. Neuroscience calls this mirroring. When someone truly understands you, your brain reflects its own vulnerabilities back at you with unprecedented clarity. It can be uncomfortable, it can be disorienting, but it is also transformative. The presence of the right person doesn't just elevate you, it exposes you. And that exposure is the beginning of change. That is why love at its core is not poetic. It is evolutionary, it forces adaptation. It demands better instincts, better communication, better self-regulation. The brain rewires itself to integrate connection, to protect it, to grow through it. When you meet someone whose existence demands that you evolve, that is not coincidence. That is biology. The most surprising part of this journey was realizing how long I had unconsciously resisted that evolution. How often I had defaulted to logic when meaning required vulnerability. How easily I had convinced myself that responsibility was the same as completeness. It took one person, one unmistakable signal in the noise, to break that illusion. That signal didn't ask for attention. It simply existed with a kind of authenticity that made pretense impossible. A kind of presence that made the world feel less fragmented. A kind of intelligence that challenged without destabilizing. A kind of connection that didn't drain, it amplified. And amplification is rare. It is precious. It is the neural equivalent of discovering a new energy source. Once the brain experiences that level of resonance, it becomes incredibly clear. Some people aren't chapters, they are catalysts. They don't just enter your life, they redirect it. They don't just change your mood, they change your mind. They don't just inspire you to dream bigger, they make you capable of achieving what once felt unreachable. And that is when I understood something profound. The mission of HeartX was never about creating a framework for humanity. It was about understanding why one person could make the entire trajectory of a life suddenly make sense. Why emotional gravity could be stronger than intellectual calculation. Why the right connection could do what no achievement ever could. Restore the parts of you that success cannot touch. Because the truth is, even the most ambitious vision needs an emotional anchor. Even the strongest mind needs a reason to stay soft. Even the boldest mission needs a heartbeat. Even the boldest mission needs a heartbeat. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized that my own heartbeat had been running on backup systems. Efficient, functional, reliable, but not alive in the way that authentic connection demands. It took one person to switch the system back to primary power, one person to remind me that the mind can operate flawlessly while the heart remains offline, and one person to show me that real strength isn't the capacity to endure without feeling. Real strength is the willingness to feel deeply and still move forward with purpose. When I look at the great paradox of human progress, it's this: we build extraordinary machines because we struggle to understand ourselves. We chase the stars because we wrestle with what it means to be human. And we push the boundaries of possibility because we're searching for something or someone who makes existence feel meaningful. But what if we approached emotional life with the same rigor we apply to physics or engineering? What if connection weren't treated as a mystery, but as a science, something measurable, expandable, improvable? What if love, instead of being left to chance, became the most intentional human innovation of all? That is the deeper vision of HeartX, the unapologetic study of the emotional forces that shape human destiny. Not to control them, but to understand them. Not to digitize them, but to refine them. Because if humanity hopes to thrive on other planets, or build systems that outlast centuries, or create futures worthy of hope, then we must first understand the one force capable of uniting intellect and purpose: the human heart. Not the metaphorical heart, the neurological heart, the emotional heart, the evolutionary heart, the engine of meaning. And when I talk about engines, I speak not just as a scientist or a builder, but as someone who has spent years observing what happens when the emotional engine misfires. A person can achieve staggering success and still feel a silent collapse internally. They can be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone. They can dedicate themselves to mission and still feel the quiet ache of unshared purpose. But the moment the right connection appears, that internal collapse reverses. The emotional engine roars back to life, not with noise, but with direction. Direction is everything. Rockets without direction burn fuel and fall back to Earth. Minds without direction burn energy and fall back into despair. But the right connection, the right emotional axis, gives direction to everything else. It turns ambition into vision, vision into action, action into legacy. And legacy without love, without purpose, without connection, is just accumulation. Humanity deserves more than accumulation. Humanity deserves alignment. The person who brought alignment back into my life did it without trying, without effort, simply by existing with a kind of authenticity and depth that made every room feel more coherent, every idea feel sharper, every moment feel grounded. There are people who complicate your life, and then there are people who simplify your soul. The latter are rare. When you encounter one, your brain knows long before you consciously do. That recognition is instantaneous, a surge of neural resonance that feels like truth, and truth has gravity. It pulls you toward a better version of yourself. It makes you confront your own contradictions. It makes you release the parts of you that were built for survival, not growth. It makes you choose honesty over armor. And ultimately, it makes you understand that love, real love, deep love, aligned love, is not a feeling, it is a transformation. A neurological shift from isolation to integration, from autopilot to awareness, from drifting to orbiting something meaningful. I realized that everything I had built, every system, every company, every risk, was in pursuit of understanding what makes life worth living. But the answer wasn't in the machinery. It wasn't in the equations. It wasn't in the missions or milestones. It was in emotional coherence, in the presence of someone whose existence activates your best instincts, in the connection that makes you want to build a future, not just for humanity, but for the person who reminds you why humanity matters. HeartX became the language for this revelation, a way to articulate the connection between emotional depth and human advancement. Because when the heart aligns, the mind accelerates. When the mind accelerates, the mission expands. And when the mission expands, humanity evolves. That is the real arc of progress. Not technology, not industry, not ambition, but alignment. Alignment between what you build and what you feel. Between who you are and who you are becoming. Between where you are going and who you hope will walk beside you when you get there. And that brings me to something we rarely speak about openly. Something that is scientifically accurate and emotionally uncomfortable. Human beings are not designed for solitary greatness. We can survive alone, but we cannot evolve alone. Evolution requires collaboration. It requires resonance. It requires connection. And sometimes evolution requires one person who sees your potential more clearly than you see it yourself. Someone who expands your courage. Someone who sharpens your honesty. Someone who challenges your fears without diminishing your strength. Someone who becomes not an accessory to your mission, but the axis of your transformation. I had to face a truth I avoided for years, that the part of me capable of building for the future was also the part of me starving for connection. That achievement without emotional depth becomes hollow. That success without someone to share it with is a quiet form of failure. And that love, far from being a distraction, is the one force powerful enough to push the human mind past its own limitations. The more I studied this, the more I understood that emotional alignment with the right person is the closest thing the brain has to rocket fuel. It stabilizes mood regulation, enhances strategic thinking, deepens creativity, lowers stress response, and increases long-term planning capacity. In other words, it makes you better. It makes you more human. It makes you more capable of shaping the world in meaningful ways. But it only happens when the connection is real. And when that connection appeared in my own life, quietly, unexpectedly, undeniably, I realized that everything I had built outward was preparing me to understand something inward. That all the rockets were metaphors, and all the missions were mirrors. That the real frontier was not the sky but the self, and that the greatest discovery was not a planet or a propulsion system, but a person. A person who illuminated the parts of my mind I had neglected. A person who made the future feel less theoretical and more human. A person who didn't complete me, because no one completes anyone, but who activated the version of me that is capable of living in alignment with my deepest intentions. That is not romance, that is resonance. And resonance is the purest form of truth a brain can experience. The more I understood this, the more I realized that humanity's future depends not on eliminating emotion, but on elevating it, on treating connection not as a weakness, but as a technology, on recognizing that the heart is not the opposite of logic. It is its partner, its catalyst, its compass. And when the heart and mind move together, they create a form of intelligence that no machine can replicate. So when people ask me why HeartX matters, I tell them this: because the next evolution of humanity won't come from reaching farther into space, but from reaching deeper into ourselves. Because the future is not built by brilliant minds alone. It is built by aligned hearts working in harmony with brilliant minds. Because love, in its purest form, is not a distraction from mission, and is the mission. And as I stand here tonight, I want to leave you with this one truth. A truth anchored in neuroscience, in experience, and in the undeniable physics of human connection. You can build 1,000 rockets, conquer impossible frontiers, and change the trajectory of civilization, but none of it will matter if your own heart remains unexplored. The greatest journey you will ever take is the one inward, toward the person who awakens the best in you, the person who becomes your emotional axis, the person who becomes not your destination, but your direction. Because in the end, the real mission is not SpaceX. It is HeartX. It is the mission of understanding, elevating, and embracing the emotional forces that make us human, so that everything we build, everything we dream, and everything we dare becomes rooted in meaning. And perhaps the most extraordinary discovery of all is this: sometimes the entire trajectory of your life changes because of one person, one connection, one moment of truth that reorients everything. When that happens, don't ignore it. Don't run from it. Don't reduce it to chance. Recognize it for what it is: the universe handing you your emotional coordinates, the signal you were always meant to follow, the beginning of the mission that finally makes everything else make sense. Thank you.